Let me share my screen. I appreciate everyone's patience as this is the first time we are doing this. So we will work through the technical things as they come up. But we're really excited that you all are here for our first webinar. I'm Mika Vandersall, founder of the Vandersall Collective, and I'm really grateful for the conversation today with Erin and Derrick called Claiming Social Justice in the Congregation, the first of our collective energy webinar series. So first, one word on who Vandersall Collective is. We are a faith-based consulting firm that works to embolden our clients to seek the change that is seeking after them. We navigate new pathways with our clients, working closely with them to realize their calling. And this often comes in various forms of things like strategic planning and then implementation through coaching and communication and fundraising practices. But to get to the topic at hand today, why we are here, our first webinar leaders are friends of mine, also Vandersall Collective consultants, colleagues, and deeply spiritual people. These two are the real deal and people that I am grateful for every single day that they are in my life. Today, they're going to talk about their very different but equally powerful experiences and their particular context seeding social justice in the life of congregations. So just to let you know how this will go. First, we'll hear from Erin, and then we will hear from Derrick. They'll tell you who they are and give you some context in their ministry and give us some content. Then they will respond to each other for a bit of time. Anytime during the webinar, you can send us questions via the Q&A feature in your window. And for the last 20 minutes of our hour together, we'll share your questions and comments with Erin and Derrick, and they'll give their thoughts and reflections. If you see a question shared by another attendee that interests you, you can click the thumbs up underneath the text so that it can help bring it to our attention and we can see that there's more than one person interested in that question. So thank you so much for joining us to kick off this webinar series, and we'll give you a heads up on the next one that we have planned at the end of the hour. So first, let's get started with Erin.
Thank you, Mika. My name is Erin Weber-Johnson, and I am so pleased to join you today. I come with about 12 years worth of strategic planning background as well as fundraising and stewardship experience. So as we think about social justice, one of the joys and challenges for me as working with congregations, as we look at missional identity, we think about then the role of the congregation as a collective group and that group's response to social justice. Now, certainly, we have lots of opportunities in the current climate for social justice in action. We have lots of ways of engagement, but oftentimes it can be a question of where do we apply our resources? How do we sustain ourselves, both in terms of energy and volunteer base, in terms of spiritual practice, in terms of funding? And so today, part of what I hope to talk about is touching on each of those points. How do you bring social justice to your congregation in a way that aligns with who you are, and then continue to allow it to continue to move with the Holy Spirit? Now, as we were planning for today, I was very much struck by my co-host, Derrick McQueen. He and I submitted separate photos for this event. As you can see to the right, Derrick, if you don't know Derrick already, you're going to be wowed by his experience, by his wisdom, by the power of who he is and the way that God works through him. And I love this picture to the right because I see that as one of the ways in which Derrick brings himself to social justice and his response thereof. On the left is a picture of me at a protest, actually, with my family. That's my son in front and a son on top of my shoulders. And prior to that event, we did a lot of conversations as a family about what did it mean to participate in protest, and reading about Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho and talking about the walls coming down. I bring this to you all because I think this is a great example of how missional identity, who we are, our experience, our characteristics as a generation, our characteristics as a culture, our experience both of church, of God, of culture, of government, of systems of oppression, we bring all of that to our response and our consideration to social justice. Who we are impacts how we show up. Mika, if you'll move on to the next slide. And so it begins with this articulation of missional identity. So how can we ensure that we remain both authentic in our response, but also adaptable to how the Holy Spirit is moving? I like to show this example. I've worked with congregations of all shapes and sizes in strategic planning and in fundraising. This is an example of a congregation that recognized that they couldn't show up for everything. They didn't feel called to protest every single event that was in their community, but they had particular pieces of particular values which they wanted to respond to. There were particular causes that they were very concerned about and the way in which it aligned in their reading of the gospel. So for one protest, they realized that the best way for them to show up was to provide kits for the protesters. And so this is an example of them as a community coming together on a Sunday morning to provide kits for if there were tear gas and food in these. I'm reminded of another example of after the recent election, when there was a move around sanctuary churches, where in some churches elected to become specifically sanctuary churches, which would allow people to come and stay for long periods of time as they were seeking a safe space away from ICE. However, others, recognizing that they didn't perhaps have the space or the volunteer resources, became sanctuary supporting. So these are two different examples of how people and organizations can still live into their values, but very thoughtfully consider their way in which they approach social justice. And so I'd like to tell a story as an example of how you can come into an alignment with your core values. This is the story of the Episcopal Church of the Holy Communion, which is outside, it's in St. Louis. After the shooting of Michael Brown, this was a congregation where half of the congregation was arrested in protests, and half of the congregation was not. The half that was arrested after during the protests were white, and the people that were not arrested were people of color. So there was a lot of distinction about who are they going to be after this event has taken place. So during that time, as they were thinking about their identity, there were also all these different opportunities for engagement. So the vestry, or we could call the leadership body, the presbytery, they wanted, for example, to put a Black Lives Matter sign on the front yard, except for the fact that only part of the vestry wanted to do that. And another part said, that's not who we are. That's not how we show up to things. So I'm going to come back to what they decided to do in just a moment. In order to come to a place where they were able to have these conversations together, what they had to first have is a conversation around core values. Who are they? And once we walked through with them a conversation about what are their core values, we had to come to a common agreement about what were the definitions for those values. So for example, in this congregation, pretty much all named and articulated diversity as a primary value. But for many, it meant advocacy and engagement. And for others, it meant belonging. It meant finding a safe place to be. It meant welcoming. So we had to come together to say, what is a common definition going to be for these core values, and walk through. Once we did that, we were able to create a rubric. a rubric it can sound like a really institutional word. It's essentially a list of questions that whenever there was an opportunity for engagement in a strategic way, whether it be through protest or an outreach effort, they would walk through the questions together to ensure that this aligned with their core values, to ensure that it was part of their ability to show up in a long-term way, so that if there was a long-term commitment, they had the resources to do that in a volunteer capacity. They had to ask themselves, is this going to complicate a conversation that they were already having? So we had a list of questions that they have continued to use moving forward at any time that they have a large strategic decision. In addition, then after that, we were able to then create a safe space for making these decisions. And there was group buy-in for what a response would look like. So what they decided to do was, instead of putting forth a Black Lives Matter sign, what they realized, something that was going to be more in keeping with the entirety of their collective identity, was to have signs that said, "We remember Michael Brown," because that was true. That was who they are and who they wanted to be as they showed up for this. They've continued then to ask these questions of, what does it mean to be diverse? What does it mean to live into this core value? And how do we show up using this rubric? Next slide, please. So what I like to talk about with congregations that are thinking about their identity, but also thinking about either the leadership's desire to still be able to write a sermon on a Sunday morning and still do pastor care. How do they do all of the things that are required? One of the things I have is a list of things that say, okay, a sustainable method for approaching social justice might include this: a shared process for dreaming and making decisions together, identified core values that articulate identity and source of life. So for example, many of the churches that I've worked with have identified worship or cultivating discipleship or a prayer life to sustain this movement. A shared sense of ownership and decision-making. So going back to the Holy Communion as a direct example, if that church had gone ahead and moved with a Black Lives Matter sign, there would have been people that might have felt disenfranchised by that decision. But since that we've collectively had the conversation of what did that core value around diversity mean, there was a shared sense of how decisions were made. There was collective buy-in for it. Then, oftentimes we think of social justice as quick responses. But actually, as we know from some of the greatest leaders of social justice, there are goals and strategies involved. There are ways in which you can plan in a long-term way for how you are going to show up. And that ultimately leads not just, I'm hoping, for change in the world, but I think as you are cultivating your own internal sense of identity, you're cultivating faithful practices of spirituality. You're asking, how is God showing up? It leads to internal transformation as well. It also then is part of the question around, okay, so how do we fund this? How do we keep this going? Like we still have to keep the lights on. For many faith communities, they have buildings and infrastructure. Since the last 2016 presidential election, we have seen in the fundraising field a rise of 2 new donor motivations that hadn't been seen before. This is really intriguing to me. What we saw was a rise in rage or catharsis donating, and we saw a rise in a desire for agency, a desire for, I'm not sure how to make a difference, but I can at least give $5 or $10 today. I have to do something. I have to feel like the world is not spinning out of control, right? This is very, very different. I'd like to tell this story. Many of you might know who Seth MacFarlane is. Seth MacFarlane is the creator and producer of many shows on the Fox network. He was so distressed by something that was said on Fox News that he recently made a $2.5 million gift to NPR. This, I think, is a great example of some of the giving that we're seeing. We're seeing record numbers of giving to advocacy-based organizations like Planned Parenthood, like NAACP, like refugee ministries. On your screen, I have an example of a Rage donation site. Yes, this actually exists. Here's what you do. All you have to do is go to this Rage Donate website, and they have quotes that could potentially make you angry, and over a whole host of things. You pick your topic about what you're angry about, and then you click on that little red button, and it sends you to different opportunities to give. This is what's happening in the world. And this is a piece of social justice. But what this tells me from my own Christian understanding is that this is a time for where Christian organizations are especially relevant. Because if we adopt a more expansive approach to stewardship, one that includes reconciliation to God and repair of the world, this directly aligns with these donor motivations. This deeply connects to folks' desire for rage and catharsis, a sense of maybe I can change the world with others, that God is moving with us. So there are thoughtful considerations when you think about who you are as an organization and the ways you're going to show up. You could be thinking about what is it that our folks in the pews are needing? Mm-hmm. And what are the ways in which we can align with these motivations when we're crafting our annual appeal or asking for financial support? There are a lot of opportunities for on-ramp here that Vandersal would be happy to talk to you more about. Next slide. And so as we're thinking about all of these different opportunities in philanthropy, another slide, I'd like us to then think about as well, what is it that we show up with? As I mentioned, we show up with who we are today. But as Derrick is going to describe with us shortly, there's a lot more to it than that. There is also history. Derrick.
I'm Derrick McQueen. I'm Reverend Derrick McQueen, and I've been doing community development for over 20 years, and I've been working on my PhD and in ministry with the New York City Presbytery for at least 10 years, if not 12 years. And I am so happy to be here with Erin because she has helped me very much to articulate much of the work that I've been doing and much of the work that I would like to continue doing around this issue of social justice and giving and how do we show up in our congregations. But who we are, I believe, is important to our response. And who we are is always, of course, impacted by our history. Many of our communities and many of our communities that are looking forward to these modern social justice issues and trying to figure out which ones do we fund, how do we fund them, what do we say about them, very often the history of a congregation or the history of a community will already have an arc of how it responds to different issues. It may be education, it may be political upset, but there's always some sort of a historical background that gives you a foundation that you can go back and visit so that you can see what your theological inclination is for your community specifically and for your congregation. Even if it's a brand new worshiping community, there's still something culturally in that community that brought those people together that says that they're able to look at understanding where our history is and who we are and why we're coming together in this space and how are we writing our narrative, especially when your birth narrative, so as a Native American friend of mine, Kathy Sanchez says from the Tewa Nation, your birth narrative is very often reconstructed by others for you. And when you go back and look at your own history, you can reconstruct your own birth narrative, and it gives you a better trajectory of what historically is important to you, and especially what social justice things that are represented now that are the same as they were 100 years ago. I like to tell this story because it's one of my favorites, and I'll be working around this in the next month or two. But in 1906, Teddy Roosevelt, he disbanded and outlawed a band of African-American soldiers that they moved to Brownsville, Texas. They were dishonorably discharged for a rumor that they broke out of barracks and that they ran rampant in Brownsville, Texas, and scared all of the white townsfolk and threatened a lot of the women. And well, of course, we know that that narrative is very much able to raise the rancor of folks in 1906. And so what they ended up doing is dishonorably discharging this group of soldiers. But here in New York City, on Thanksgiving Day in 1906, it's recorded in the New York Times, 4 churches in Harlem came together to decry what had been done by Teddy Roosevelt, to decry the fact that people were silent, and for those who had the vote, that if you wanted to vote for Teddy Roosevelt to be president again, maybe you needed to move deep in the South where your vote doesn't matter. And they also did this massive offering where they all streamed down the aisle with their money in hand and threw it into the offering plate. And that money was used to support the families of those soldiers who had been dishonorably discharged. 100 years later, and 112 years later, many of the people in the congregations that are still worshiping for Thanksgiving just thought this was a tradition that they took, in which they took part, and didn't realize that it was part of a social justice claim for equality and for fair treatment of folk. And we reclaimed that. And in reclaiming that, we found a new way to sort of understand and connect Black Lives Matter and civil rights to something that happened in Harlem over 100 years ago, 112 years ago. So it was very much a connection that this is what we've always done, rather than creating this new narrative. But once again, as Erin was saying, how do we fund all of this? And even if it's just for the people who are walking down the aisles, throwing their money into the plate in defiance of the dishonorable discharged soldiers and the status of them, what happens and how do we fund this? And I asked this question about what do these 3 persons have in common? Harry Belafonte, Aretha Franklin, and James Baldwin. We all know them for their artistic merit and for everything that they've given to the cultural world, but these were 3 major benefactors of the civil rights movement. They used their power, they used their money specifically to actually sort of fund what mattered to them and to fund the persons and the people who were in leadership so that the protests and all of those things could go on. And they spurred up this giving notion in communities. So when we hear Harry Belafonte singing Day-O and seeing people jump up, it's not just because it's a popular song. It's because it's a popular song that's associated with a major funder of the civil rights movement. Aretha Franklin did the same thing. And of course, we know that James Baldwin was an outspoken advocate for civil rights. And this is a very important notion to that. But what do we do as little persons, the little people that are sitting in church on Sunday morning or sitting in our communities? I love this idea that I've been trying to redefine what philanthropy is in smaller congregations. Philanthropy has now been relegated to the super rich. You can go ahead to that next slide, Mika. Only the super rich are able to call themselves philanthropists and to make a dent in some of these issues that are in the world. That's not the case with many African-American congregations and smaller congregations when we learn the history and when we learn their story. Lucy Laney Craft was an education pioneer in the South who, in order to fight the lack of education of Black students, she created schools. And little did I know in researching the history of one of our New York City churches, St. James Presbyterian Church, where I'm serving as pastor now, that they had about 25 guilds, and each of these guilds all funded these social justice efforts that were going on in the 1920s and the 1930s. And one of the major ones that I like to point out, next slide please, is Lucy Laney Craft. She and her schools were funded by the Lucy Craft Laney Guild at St. James Presbyterian Church, and they were responsible for 3 to 5 schools that lasted for at least 40 years. So 40 years worth of African-American students were educated on the monies of a small congregation in New York City. And this giving notion of philanthropy, and when we bring our money together and we name our institutions from which we're giving, when we pool our money together and name our institutions as philanthropic institutions as well as mission-guided institutions, then we sort of expand the voice of those who are actually making a difference in some of these social justice efforts in the world. Lucy Laney Craft Schools, even one of our elders right now in our clerk of session, she still remembers the Lucy Craft Laney schools and being in competition with them and playing basketball when they were down south. So this is a powerful, powerful legacy that not many people know about, but was funded by small congregations who believed in education. And I believe that there's a movement afoot, and that there's an opportunity afoot for our communities and congregations to recast ourselves in this conversation about how do we give and who are we as giving partners. Yes, we are mission driven. And spiritually, I honestly believe that the more you give in mission, the more it comes back to you. And I've seen that actually happen. But we have a hard time when the ceiling is falling down and when the lights need to be turned on, or when the Con Ed or electric bill comes in at $10,000 during the middle of the winter. But there's a way to find these things of which we are which we care about and are passionate about, that our $5 and $10 do help, as Erin was saying, for that notion. Much of this that happened in New York City, especially in the 1920s and then around the world, came to be known as this social gospel. We are called now to use the gospel of Christ to heal the social ills of the world. But it's not just a call to personal conversion to Christianity, but it was a call to social reform. And it was a union of the gospel and social reform. And much of the research that I've done for many of the churches around the turn of the century and in the early 20s, especially after the downfall of Wall Street in 1929, it was all of those help programs that were done by the WPA, that were sent out by the government. Most of those left the people at the bottom of the barrel without any government aid. So the communities came to one another's help. They built brownstones so that people could they built hospitals for senior citizens. They built old age homes for senior citizens. Father Divine himself fed hundreds of people every day throughout the week during the Depression. So these are ways that we know that the social gospel calls us to do what's right and to feed the oppressed and take care of the widow and take care of the orphan. But we have the voice to also claim that gospel of ours is social justice. And I think that that's a very important notion to understanding how we sort of recast philanthropy, recast social justice, and recast even our fundraising within our own congregations. I love this idea of this conversation and having similar goals and values and shared decision making. And I'd like to speak to the notion of permission giving ministries, which is something that when I first heard the term, I was like, well, no human being really should have that much capacity to sort of get permission for that. But when I sat in on a conversation with a minister about a particular ministry that was happening at a church in Southern Jersey, it dawned on me what we were really doing. We were having a facilitated conversation about how is the Holy Spirit calling this a ministry? And it was simply nothing more than a bazaar in the church parking lot. But what we understood is that it actually became a ministry for senior citizens who were on fixed income to be able to give more to the church, as we're asking for more money in stewardship every year. The bazaar enabled people to empty out their attics bit by bit and to give that money to the church. And that was a ministry in and of itself to our senior citizens. So the Holy Spirit, when we're in conversation with these ideas that we have, the Holy Spirit can sort of in prayer and biblical reflection help us to see where the permission is giving for us to really allow this to be a ministry of the Spirit. And that ministry of the Spirit, once it's given that permission by the Trinity, by whatever is holy or whatever is divine in your community, it enables you to be more vocal and to be more articulate in your beliefs and in your cultural norms about why it's important to do what you're doing. Which is why, and this whole notion about social reform, and I'm going to use the example of gentrification. In terms of gentrification, it's in many Harlem neighborhoods and in many neighborhoods, African-American neighborhoods in St. Louis that are being encroached on, and people are being sort of moved out, and what that all looks like. How do you really reclaim what that social justice is? And part of it is by not giving up your history and inviting people to share in your history, to share in your goals for social reform. And that social gospel in a new and changing community environment brings people together, but it also brings monies to the fore for how we can sort of fight some of the things that we really care about in social justice. But it's the invitation for others to join in social gospel, and it's the invitation for the Holy Spirit to help us define what our ministries are by giving us that permission and prayer and in Bible and theological reflection. And it's also the notion that we've always been doing this, so there really is no reason for us to say that we have never done this before and this is something new. And finally, for me, it's stepping up with in the language of other philanthropists to say, our church bodies, our congregational bodies, by pooling our monies together, we are also the face of philanthropy. And I believe that that's where I will leave us so that we can take some questions.
Before we do, can I just jump in as a piggyback in? One of the things that you just said I thought was very intriguing, which was the permission giving. Because on the flip end, if you're thinking about having like a rubric or having an idea of asking some important questions and thinking about who are we, what have we always been doing, one of the things that has come up with some of the congregations I've worked with is sometimes we've actually had to prayerfully consider stop doing things as a response to social justice, like divesting or working with particular partners or different neighborhood agencies that had particular outreaches that have had to change. So I think that was a really powerful point that you've just made about permission giving and the way it can align with having a real process and an infrastructure for creating buy-in and also organizational response to social justice.
And I like that. I like the way that you put that as well, because especially when you're asking for permission to stop doing things.
Yeah.
Because in so many of our communities, we are so beholden to tradition, and we don't even know where the tradition comes from. And sometimes, as we were reforming our ways of thinking and transforming ourselves in our way of thinking, we still hold on to those things that are sort of taking up and preoccupying our time. And we sort of need some sort of permission to let it go.
That's right.
To let it be and to keep it in the annals of our history, but say that this is not something that's actively calling us right now.
So, for example, I can tell you there was a church that had this yard sale. How many churches around the country do yard sales, right? And they claim the community, the value of community, right? We're doing this for the community, or we're doing this for a fundraiser, except, by the time they add up all the volunteer hours, they could have like tripled the gift, right?
Right.
But so there was a church that went through this process of saying, okay, is this really doing any good? And what they decided was, no, it would be better for us to work with some of our neighborhood partners to really strategically align our resources in a better way. So I think you're spot on there, Derrick.
Thank you. And the rage and catharsis is also something that I'm really very responsive to with your presentation, Erin, because very often rage gets to a point where we don't have an outlet for it.
That's right.
And we are called to sort of have some sort of a cathartic understanding of why we're enraged, or even to sort of think about how we can respond in our race to something else that is going on that's even triggering our own trauma that makes us go down on our knees in prayer. But it helps us to assuage a little bit of what it is that we're going through in our own specific communities when we find things that enrage us, that are on the national platform or the international platform or in another state or in another community. And speaking up in solidarity with that is a very powerful notion of saying you are not alone. And then the flip side is that I'm not alone.
That's right.
So that rage and catharsis, it's sort of, it doesn't have the flame of rage, but it has the passion of rage.
Yeah.
Change happen.
That's exactly right. That's right. We give so we know that we're not alone. I love that. That's a great quote.
And there's another notion that I've been using about social justice that has been very, very important for me. And that is that the idea of working for social justice and the idea of freeing the oppressed and working for those who are suffering is it's an opportunity for those who believe in the gospel, those who believe in joy, that somewhere where you are working for social justice, you are working for someone who has not been able to experience joy to experience joy.
Wow.
And that to me has been a very powerful message that has been resonant with many communities I've been speaking with over the past year, is that what the work that we're doing is we are affording someone somewhere the opportunity to experience a modicum of joy where they have not before. And if that's not a call for the gospel, I don't know what is.
I agree.
We have our first question in. Erin, here's a question for you. And for others, if you want to type questions or comments in your Q&A box, that would be great. And we can continue to move into questions as we're continue to engage in conversation. So here's the question, Erin. You mentioned that Holy Communion stopped a movement to put up the Black Lives Matter sign and stepped back to gather consensus. Can you talk to us about that moment? How did this happen? How was that the response rather than a response of creating camps and divisions and further conflict?
That was a fabulous question. Whoever wrote that question, may I applaud you. That was wonderful. I think you spoke just to the heart of it, because oftentimes we do have things that we're passionate about, and the values, even a commonly held value, can have different definitions and have different responses to the same value. So what happened here was that at the same time that that conversation was taking place, there was actually a clergy transition that took place. So there was a new rector coming in, or a new minister. And so what happened was, when that new minister came in, the new minister said, I am seeing that we have some missional identity work to do. Rather than us just keep on staying busy, I want us to get to know one another. And so he actually hired me as a consultant to come in and engage in a process of determining what are the questions that need to be asked, what is the language that is accessible for asking questions, because that's really important. We have to ask the right questions for what and for whom. And then once we asked these questions, then we were able as a group to come to some collective definitions and have conversation about what those definitions meant. Then finally, once we had those commonly held definitions, we were able to create that list of a rubric, essentially, of, okay, so now that we have, for Holy Communion, they've got 4 core values that they have definitions and a framework around, which is welcome and diversity, internal community, and external community, the response to it. Once we had some working definitions to what those were, then we were able to create a rubric and say, okay, now, based on this rubric, how does this run through the Black Lives Matter? The Black Lives Matter run through this. Now, let me be clear. The church didn't have anything. They have no qualms with Black Lives Matter. They were highly supportive. It's more of how did they want to show up to the way that the Holy Spirit was moving in this particular movement.
So there was there was leadership that, what I hear you saying is that there's this clergy transition which provided leadership that was absolutely necessary to be able to make this transition happen, from camping up with each other and dividing with each other to stepping back, that it came from real pastoral leadership that allowed that to happen. What an extraordinary place that they were open to that kind of conversation.
I completely agree. I applaud the leadership. I also applaud the ability to stop, because I feel like so much of what we feel right now is a desire, and it's a good desire to respond, to do something. I have these emotions, but they stopped and they prayerfully together worshiped together every Sunday morning, right? They were still inviting the Holy Spirit into these conversations. And then they started then strategically, when I talk about, when I say they started creating responses, yeah, some of them were, we're going to put a sign on the yard, but they also started saying, okay, what are we going to do over the next year as part of this response? Yeah. And so there was a very strategic intent to it as well. And I think that that's also part of, frankly, the benefit of having an external person come in. In this case, both the rector and I were new people coming in, is that there's a way in which we can listen together and reflect back together. And assumptions that are sometimes commonly held, having an external presence question some of that assumption is often helpful.
Great. You want to, I have a question for you, Derrick.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a question for you. And others, if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box for us. So you talked about birth narrative work. Have you done this in your congregation? And do you have guidance on how to do this work?
Yes, actually, I've been working on that now for the past 8 months, because the history and the birth narrative of the particular church, St. James, goes much further back into the first colored Presbyterian church of New York City, Shiloh Presbyterian. And looking at that history and saying, well, what birthed that church? What birthed this mission? What birthed this need? And the actual need became, the birth narrative became freedom around abolition and creating community around those who needed to experience freedom in a new way, and who needed community, and who needed skills, and who found a theological way and a theological family and a denomination that would hold them as God's people. That's why William Henry Garnett became Presbyterian, and it's why he came to Shiloh in the first place. And it's also why the founder of St. James came to Shiloh in the first place, was because of this abolition narrative. So now that we've sort of noticed that there's this abolition narrative, this community building narrative, and this safety net for those who feel as if their freedom has always been compromised but are looking to be free, how does that birth narrative explain where we are now? It's actually been very helpful in the LGBT affirming and inclusive narrative of St. James, because it's yet another front where liberation and freedom wants to be contained and to be held and be lifted up as something that's holy and something that can be held in community, as well as education. We hold that whole idea that these slaves needed to be able to read, to have education, and the Presbyterians were very much into that. And this congregation wanted to very much make sure that I'm finding that as history went through, that the birth narrative of Shiloh has actually really been well woven into the spirit and the life and the ministry and mission of the congregation, lo these 123 years, almost 200 years when you count Shiloh. So that's part of the work. But in terms of the work during the interim part of doing the ministry, in terms of the birth narrative, it's about saying, well, we had the documentation from 40 years ago that says what the deacons are supposed to do. What has called you to be a deacon, and what new birth has happened in you to say that you want to be a deacon? So what is your birth narrative and your ministry as a deacon? What is your birth narrative and your ministry as an elder? When is the first moment that you knew that something was calling you to something different? And then building that birth narrative, and then building out the trajectory of your history of leadership and ministry and how God has led you has been really a powerful tool that has been very helpful. And now with the young people, they're able to start afresh with their birth narrative and starting to understand where they are as members of the church, as members who are being shepherded in their baptismal vows until they do their confirmation where they make their own choices. They're in the middle now of creating this narrative because their birth narrative is so fresh to them. So yes, I am doing that.
So I just got a question in, but I wanted to respond briefly before we read this third question, which is a really good question. It seems like for both of these congregations, deeply knowing who you are is a very important piece in being able to be disciples. And digging into knowing who you are as well as God knows who you are, and that we are not just individuals, but the collective we of who we are is almost is equally as important as the individual of who God has created us to be. Would you say that's true, or would you argue with that?
Can you just, I'm sorry, I had something up on the screen that I was sort of trying to process. Can you just pinpoint those points again?
Yeah, that knowing who you are is deeply important. Knowing that identity of who you are as well as God knows who you are, even though it's scary to really know ourselves really well, is important for both of these contexts, and being able to appreciate the importance of the collective knowing of who you are just as much as the individual.
Yes, because there's a lot of healing that goes on when you're doing that creation, because it's not, birth narratives are not always pretty.
That's right.
So when you are identifying who you are and coming to know yourself, like in many African-American churches, and especially even in Harlem today and in Detroit and other places, Chicago, there's a narrative of exclusion in African-American churches because of the color of your skin. Mm. So if you are not the paper bag color or coffee with cream color, if you're darker than that, then you are excluded. They can support the ministry of someone like Lucy Laney Craft, but she would not be welcome to be a major part of the congregation because of the darkness of her skin. So how do we deal with that? And how do we deal with how the clashing birth narratives and the clashing notions of how we have excluded and how we have hurt people in our past, that becomes the new way of being in conversation about what do we need to claim as part of our history, and what do we need to sort of say, well, now that we've claimed that, what do we need to do in order to move past that, or in order to even think about how God is calling us to react to even our own actions of the past.
That's right.
So this is a great, let me do the segue, Erin, and then have you respond to both if you don't mind. This question is, you maybe saw this, Derrick. I don't know if you saw this as you were going to this direction, but here's the next question. Not every congregation is going to have a birth narrative of freedom and welcome and inclusion. So how to deal with congregations that have participated in and supported oppression and violation? What do we do when our birth narrative and history includes injustice perpetrated on others, or maybe just injustice against others tolerated or left unaddressed or unchallenged? How do we engage with those parts of our birth narratives that we're not so proud of, perhaps?
I think that's, I'm reminded of Gary Dorian's inaugural address when he was named chair at Union. And he was talking about his theological forefathers, unfortunately, and he was talking about Tillich. And he said with everything that was going on and in all of the civil rights movement and all of the oppression of all of the people of color and the people who were poor during the tenure of these major theologians in the 20th century, why were they silent? And just hearing, it wasn't helpful, you know, that it was like going to change the world, that what Tillich said was helpful, but he basically just said, we just didn't know what to say and how to handle that. And Dorian claiming that that was not a sufficient answer. That was not a sufficient answer, enabled the conversation to move forward to say, well, what is the sufficient answer to the silence of the hatred and the oppression that was thrown out in our country while all of these major theologians were sort of making their claim of how to think about and how to know God. So it sparked an entirely new theological conversation about, so what are we now called to address, and what is God calling us to address? Because we know that we left things undressed for a reason. And part of that reason is just because we felt unable to do anything. It can be hurtful, it can be painful, but those conversations are part of the healing.
Yeah.
Erin, you want to say something? Because I saw you unmute.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I'm reminded. So going back to the congregational example, thinking about it, because your words were really powerful. I'm still reflecting on them, to be honest, Derrick. On such a macro level, on congregational level. I'm reminded that when we were having conversations about what does diversity mean, what is it that we hold in common, many of the conversations and the narratives spoke to exactly a congregation that wasn't always welcoming, a congregation that people didn't belong. One of the stories that I heard, a man in leadership stood up and said, "This is my family's been in this church for 3 generations, and this is the first time, my generation is the first generation where we didn't sit in the back." So having this conversation about we share these values in common, but then within this commonly held framework, having the narrative come in, I think is an important piece of reclamation. And also to your earlier point of permission giving, I think as well, because I think that the question is rooted in how do we have these conversations that are authentic and real while still remaining whole, right? How do we respond in a way that keeps us whole? And so I think that there are ways in which we can shape the conversations around what do we hold in common and where is there pain and that we need to attest to, and some truth telling, and how do we respond? So for in this congregation, one of the ways that they wanted to visually express this is they're in the midst of a capital campaign right now. And they've been looking around and all the windows have white faces. And so as they're telling the story of their faith tradition, they look on a Sunday morning, the windows, our eyes to the soul don't reflect the people that are in our pews or who we want to be. So how are we going to change that identity now?
And is that part of the capital campaign, to change windows?
That could be. We're hoping so.
Wow. So we have 5 minutes left. Are there any things that you want?
Mika, there's one thing that I did want to say, because this window conversation really struck me. There's a parishioner who is finding that that they're being called for their family legacy to think about putting in a new stained glass window in Harlem at St. James.
In the as part of the exploration of the birth narratives?
Right. And for the first seed of the thought with that, it would be some sort of an African-American representation of something holy. And so the artist that we put this family in contact with did this drawing of this very powerful Rasta Black Jesus. But they still wanted to put the window on the closed window facing Harlem School of the Arts and nowhere near the streets. And they were still saying he's too Black in a Black church, and being afraid of the exclusion that would happen in our churches and in our communities if we represented ourselves that way. So now the conversation is having this large Black Jesus face St. Nicholas Street, St. Nicholas Avenue at 141st Street, and what that might look like, and what that does to shift the narrative of our cultural understanding of ourselves within the theology of being Christian. So that's that conversation, and that you reminded me of that. So even within, as you're dealing, we have to deal with the internal struggles that we have as well. So I just wanted to point that out as an
Well,
example.
it's just striking to me how much what we create externally is a reflection of who we are, who we've been created to be, how God has made us. And there's a need for those to align. Really cool. I have another comment here. Oakhurst Presbyterian Church in Decatur, Georgia redid some of their windows as part of their transformation when Nib Stroop and Caroline Leach were co-pastors. Not sure they made it to a black rusted Jesus, but they did. So others have done it, indeed.
Yeah, the Covenant Baptist
reflect the internal and external.
Covenant Baptist UCC Church in Washington, D.C. Is the same artist that I sort of put the family in contact with, and all of their windows have been redone to be civil rights and African American icons, and it's a very powerful place to be on a Sunday morning preaching with those witnesses there.
Yeah, different experience, right? Yeah. All right, you have 30 seconds for a last-minute thought, if you'd like, and then we'll announce our next webinar.
I defer to Erin.
That's very kind. I think it's important for us to have these conversations as a church, because oftentimes what happens is that we lose the holy in the midst of doing, and we lose who we are in the midst of responding with anxiety. And I think that this is a way that we as a church can faithfully show up both to what God is calling us to be and to do, but also who we are and who we have been. And so my colleague Derrick, which I was doing the Episcopal Amen, by the way, during your entire piece, and I are just so grateful for this space to do this, and also for the opportunity to work at Vandersall Collective, where these conversations take place and where we get to work with clients that are committed to this work as well.
Yes.
Thank you, Erin. Do you want to say anything else, Derrick? Or have you said enough?
No, I've said enough. So.
Okay, great. Thank you, both of you, and also the folks who asked questions. It definitely made the hour richer. So we will have our next webinar on November 6th at 2 o'clock, and that will be featuring Larissa Kwangabezia and Thea Reggio. So we look forward to seeing you then and putting that in your calendar, the next collective energy webinar that will collect some energy together for God's work. So thank you to all of you, and please be in touch if anything comes up or we struck something that you want to continue this conversation, and looking forward to seeing you in November. Thanks a lot.